Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, take it away.
Got my glasses and notes. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Welcome, everyone. This evening's webinar is on water harvesting and soil building. We're going to talk about swales on contour, hugel culture beds, a little bit about rain gardens, all variations of slowing, sinking, and spreading water. So yeah, my first book, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist, covers, can someone mute the other folks?
I'm gonna mute, but just wait 1 second, because when I hit mute all, I'm gonna mute you by, default. So hang on. Okay, mute all.
Variegates are coming.
Well,
Oh, wait a second. Okay, was he under?
Have we lost him?
no, she's trying to mute everybody.
Okay. Is his? Okay. I think. Okay, Michael, you can go ahead.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So tonight's talk on water harvesting and soil building is well covered in my first book, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist. A lot of the particulars for size and scale and material lists can all be found in there. My other book, For the Love of Pawpaws, also has sections on water harvesting, swale building, soil building that's very appropriate for the pawpaw, but also applicable to all kinds of fruits and your garden and things that we're going to talk about tonight. I live in this beautiful circular straw bale house in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Frederick, Maryland, where we have lots of swales and hugelculture beds. Really, our whole property is designed for water harvesting and management. We live in a riparian zone, so we have a creek that runs through it, thus the name of our homestead, Long Creek Homestead. So it's a challenge that actually gives us a lot of opportunity to work with water and all of the abundance that water brings. There's a cliche saying in permaculture that the problem is the solution, and really I think a lot of times this is the case with water, especially in the modern day built environment, which is not very well designed for water. We feel challenged with it, but if we're creative with it, then it really becomes an amazing resource. And we'll get into details why. So these are two pawpaws sitting on a swale, and the plant between them is a lead plant, and we're going to talk about that in the next webinar, so you'll have to hold tight for that. What I want to focus on here is the swale. So a swale in conventional terms is pretty much a ditch. A lot of times at the bottom of a suburban yard, there's a ditch. It's off contour, which means it's slanted and it's carrying water away as fast as possible. Water comes off your roof, your driveway, your lawn, goes down into that ditch and shoots into the local stream and watershed as fast as possible. That's the typical concept of a swale in conventional means. Now, if we take that and we take that ditch, which I'm going to call a basin, if we take that basin and we put it on contour, which means that it's perfectly perpendicular to the slope. Think of it sort of like your arms stretched out like a big smiley face, and the water coming down is falling in, and it's being captured, right? So that's on contour. We're going to talk more about that as well. So a little diagram out of the book. So the concept of a swale on contour is a big one in permaculture and edible landscaping, and indeed is probably, I probably use swale design in 70% of my landscape designs and installations. And that is because it's so effective in harvesting water where you need it into the groundwater. And then it also builds soil. So the main ingredient for building soil is consistent moisture, right? So breaking the swale down, I like to call it a basin and a berm. So the basin is the dugout portion. That dugout portion gets put on the downhill side and becomes your berm, your raised bed, right? So it's on contour, which means so as that water comes down the slope and falls into that basin, it's not shooting one way or the other, it's stopping and then it's filtering and sinking in. And it's hydrating the water table, not just for your raised berm, but for 30, 40 feet down slope, it's helping hydrate your landscape. So that could be more lawn, it could be your rose collection, it doesn't matter. It's going to make that hydrated, which means it's going to make it lush and productive, right? So key ingredient here, this is also known as passive, water harvesting, passive irrigation. So by setting this in motion, by sort of creating these swales up front, it's just going to happen every time it rains, every time there's water, you're harvesting it. And the effects of this are huge, and we'll see a lot of examples of that.
Michael, what do you do if your land is flat?
So here's a great example. This is almost a flat landscape you're looking at here. So the water was coming off, still does come off, I guess, this roof and this back patio, these hardscapes, right? And it was falling into this area just past their patio, and it was a quagmire. It was wet, and that was, of course, where they wanted their garden. It's a great spot right outside the kitchen window. So we dug these swales so that we're creating the raised berm. So the berm then sits at a raised height. It's a raised bed. So it's got aeration to the root zone, yet it has access to all that moisture below. It's a sweet, sweet spot to have. And the plants really respond well to that. So yeah, I've found wet spots not to be that, it's actually a way to utilize them. We're going to talk about hugelkultur beds as well later, which also do really well in extremely wet spots where, you just can't even get digging. But yeah, some of the caveats that I'll cover, for swales, there's a tipping point with how steep the slope gets. Where a swale may not be appropriate, but I've had success building these in low areas that were just kind of boggy and then became, a space you could really grow in. Okay, so quick, simple concept here. Digging out the basin, creating that downhill berm, shaping it up into a nice raised bed. Now for me, these are the ultimate raised beds. Most people, when they hear about raised beds, they're thinking about something boxed in, right? So you've got your wooden planks and you have a raised bed. Now that's a step in the right direction as far as not compacting your soil and walking on it, but it quite literally blocks the flow of moisture and water coming into it. And those beds dry out very quickly. And if anyone here's got those beds, they know what I'm talking about. So this kind of raised bed is naturally harvesting and holding moisture. So for me, quite different function. When I'm talking about a raised bed, I'm talking about these swales. And then of course, here comes the water. It falls into that basin, stops and sinks in. So here's another example of a flat backyard outside someone's kitchen that was a wet spot, but again, the best spot for a garden because of its location. And so we created a series of miniature swales on contour that then created a very productive garden for them. So, the scale of this is variable. It's something as small and neat as this to ranging across, larger acreage, which we'll touch on as well. There's really no sort of limit or, length of swale. So you can go from 10 feet, up to thousands. And they look gorgeous, they fit the landscape because they're following the landscape. So even if you are not familiar, say you're driving by someone's house and you see these beautiful swales, and you're going to say, wow, it looks really good. And you're not even going to recognize that that's because it's following the natural flow of the landscape, but it brings it to life. So it's like pulling the architecture of the land out some. So I find these to be very, very sort of sinuous, very sexy. I like the curves that these create a lot. Now, of course, the curves are going to vary on how much your contour is changing. So on a very flat landscape, it's not going to be as curvy. Okay, so how do we find contour? You don't need big, fancy, expensive transits, though they do work. You can make, very simply, an A-frame. And you can do this with scrap wood. You can do it with a little mason's bubble level. You could tape a whole level right onto this thing, or you can go old school and you can use a rock that hangs from it and swings. I cover this in my book in more detail, but it's really quite simple. 3 pieces of wood, the same length. This will create the tool that you're able to walk across your landscape and mark the contour. Now, this is key in the sense of getting to see what it would look like, before you start digging and jumping in. You can get landscape flags, you can go out there, and you can see how it looks and where it flows on your landscape, because you want to make sure your swales aren't going to get into your pathways or ways that you're moving across your landscape already. And sometimes, moving your swale up or down 10, 15 feet and starting again and marking it out, you'll get a slightly different run. So it's worth playing with. Here's just a little diagram from the book that really shows how simple this is. So I really do recommend, putting one of these together. Scrap wood is fine. You do not need to go buy lumber for this. Anything that's 3 pieces of the same length works really well. You attach the two legs at the top. You attach one side of the horizontal piece. Then you put it on a level surface like a garage floor. And the other end, the other side, I should say, of the horizontal piece, you just run that up and down that leg until your level in the middle shows you to be perfectly level, and boom, screw it. And then it's calibrated. Then you have an A-frame that you can go out and start finding contour with. It's really that simple. It's really fun and exciting to go out there and start to learning how to do this. So I really encourage this step. It'll probably encourage and actually get you to be doing some swales. And then again, just swinging across your landscape. You can make these, a couple feet tall. You could make them 5, 6 feet tall. I think an average height, I would shoot for about 4 feet so that your flags are pretty easy to follow. Okay, so these don't necessarily even have to be for edible landscapes because they have ecological function. They're helping slow down and filter the runoff, and that in itself is a wonderful service to our watersheds. So this design, the client really loved tulips. It was a bit under a tree. You can see the tree over there. I stay at least 10 feet away from core tree roots before I do this, but a small swale and berm system like this, as I'll explain here shortly, you're not digging very deep. You might only be digging 8 inches for that berm in depth. For that basin in depth. So you don't really need heavy equipment. Most all of the swales that you'll see have been done by hand pretty easily. And it's good therapy. You can go out there and chip away at it. Okay, so this is a swale. Now the wood chips that you see all the way around it are kind of just framing the bottom and the side of the berm, because one of the tricks that I've learned over time is to lay down cardboard, and I'll show this a little bit later in more detail, but so you're digging your basin, you're creating your berm. I put down cardboard where I know that other side of the berm is going to be, because otherwise when I'm done building this, the grass is just going to jump right back into my raised bed. So I lay down the cardboard and then I start to overlap the berm onto it. And in this picture, you can see that I come along and I can go ahead and cover that with wood chips or mulch, and really kind of frames it nicely. Now, a lot of water was coming down this landscape from that barn and from the driveway. And just out of the shot downslope is a very conventional, not extremely well-designed garden for any kind of water harvesting. And so now I had to retrofit because I couldn't get into their garden and do anything. I retrofitted by building this swale right above their garden to capture all this water, sink it into the ground, and hydrate their garden below it. So maybe that'll give some folks some ideas. If you've already got some set garden in place, you can maybe do this above it. And for wells, this is a great way to help rehydrate wells. Okay. So you want to make this as smooth as possible when you're digging your basin. And a couple of tricks here. So first, you're going to dig out your sod layer or your weeds, whatever's growing on top of that soil, and you want to flip it upside down. So if it's grass, the grass is going to go face down on top of the other grass that's there. This is an important organic material and nutrient layer to include. So you're flipping that upside down. Then as you continue to excavate, you're putting that soil on top of that, and you're starting to build up your berm. Now here's a few details. This is for a small to medium-sized swale, something that you might typically see in a suburban yard that has, moderate amount of water coming into it. So your basin, 20, I would actually, go up to 30 inches just to give yourself a little more room, because your basin then becomes your walking path, right? So it stacks that function. And your berm, I hope I'm getting these terms right. So the berm, your raised bed, is, I like to shoot for 3 feet in width. I'm always reading, or I used to always read, because I stopped reading it, everyone was saying, do your beds at 4 feet in width. And I mean, unless you're like a serious yogi, it's hard to reach in on a 4-foot bed. So I like to stick to about 3 feet in width for my raised berms. So that way it can easily reach everything. And there's that cardboard trick. You see the cardboard? I put it down before I started digging. I measured out 3 feet, so I knew where my raised bed was going to end. That's the first sod layer flipped upside down. Again, you see see how I have it centered? I don't have that sod layer all the way toward the end of my 3 foot. I'm putting that in the center because I'm going to really try and bury it right in the middle of the finished bed. But you see that cardboard overlaps and it goes beyond where the actual berm is going to be. That's an important trick. And another trick, let me see here. Okay, another trick. So then you've got your soil on top. Another trick here is, you see that flag? There's about 3 or 4 inches there at the beginning. I come along and I actually dig that out as well, because there's another opportunity for that grass or those weeds to lick right back up into your beautifully newly made raised berm. Right? Small tricks make a difference. So then I put the soil in, and then I'll typically go ahead and I'll amend it. I'll bring in some compost, some leaf grow, that's some of our municipal compost, whatever, fine organic matter. And I'll go ahead and I'll mix it up a little bit into that soil, because usually it's not great. What we're digging out of our landscapes is usually not that rich. So I'll go ahead and I'll jumpstart it with that. And then if need be, go ahead and start planting in it. But ideally, you would put a cover crop on it, or generously cover it with straw and let it sit and start to digest and give it time. So you can jump in and start using it right away, or you can let it sit. The longer it sits, sort of the more it'll start to break down, and the soil biota and everything get going there. All right, so here's actual example. This is where we've just dug out the basin and we've put the sod and the soil, and now we've got the compost on top that we're starting to mix in on that berm. And there you see the berm pretty nicely made. Went ahead and sort of raked it nice. So we have a pretty good planting surface. It's about 3 feet. And you can see how this one really is pretty zigzag. Do not be surprised when you're out there with your A-frame if all of a sudden it takes a 90-degree turn. That's because in the area above it, there's a ridge in the landscape. Sometimes very hard to see with the eye, but there's slight ridges where water will suddenly be going to the left, and then after that ridge, it's going to go to the right. So don't think you're doing something wrong if you're out there with your A-frame and it takes a dramatic turn to the right. Sometimes, that's just the lay of the land above you. And another tidbit, if you're out there with your A-frame, is if you're coming up to something that's artificially raised or lowered, say a rock or a groundhog hole, hop over that a little bit. Don't let your leg of your A-frame sit or go down into an artificially high or low spot. Gauge it and hop it over that and continue. I put cardboard in the basin of this basin, but it's really not necessary. I mean, it's great material to have in there because it's carbon and it'll start breaking down into compost as well. Pretty much at that depth, you've dug out most of the roots. Again, that's about 8 inches deep. 8 inches does not sound like a lot, but when you dig 8 inches, it's quite a bit of material. And keep in mind that the size of your raised berm is going to be equivalent to the depth and the width of your excavated basin, right? So don't get all crazy because you'll end up with a huge berm. And there is a balance point with your berm where I shoot for about 12 inches in height when I'm building it, knowing that it'll drop probably about 3 inches from that once some of the air comes out of it. But if you go too high, then you start to get in the risk zone that it could dry out. You're getting high and you're more exposed to winds. And so I try to stick with about 1 foot in height for these kind of average size, more yard scale swales. And I'll talk about larger swales and show you some other larger swales in a little bit. Okay, then I generously cover all that. Newspaper is my preferred for the raised berms. Cardboard works, but it's harder to kind of help hold the curves, hunker down, if you will. It tends to want to stick out. It can catch the wind and look unsightly. I think these things should look good. So I like to use newspaper, and you can see I'm not really opening it too much. I'm using a section, and I'm laying and overlaying and overlaying and overlaying. And this is wonderful. This is mulch. This is mulch. This is helping keep that first flush of weed seeds and whatever's in that earth that you just overturned. It's starting to hold moisture. It draws up worms. Worms love newspaper. They're going to come up there. They're going to start tilling through that soil. They're going to start eating the newspaper, excreting castings. They're going to be fertilizing, further tilling it for you. Really, I can't say enough about using newspaper and cardboard for conditioning soil, holding moisture, keeping down weeds and other things that might cause you more work and effort. So I'm a big fan of that. And then there it is, voila. I like to use straw again because it breaks down quickly. So that newspaper and straw is quickly going to become food for the soil biota. It's going to help build your garden soil really quick. And then wood chips, I like to use wood chips to fill in the basin. This becomes a humid holding zone. So as that water comes in there, it stops. And long after the water is gone, the humidity will be held in those wood chips, and it slowly just, emits and lets go of that humidity around the plants. And they love that. It's almost greenhouse-like. And the real bonus here too is that those wood chips are going to start breaking down pretty quickly. I'd say within about 18 months, it's broken down, especially on the lower levels, into this really rich, black, nutrient dense compost that you can just dig out and throw onto the bed right next to it and lay down more wood chips. So you're making compost in place. You're already eliminating the need to be bringing in more material, except for some lightweight new wood chips. So great compost right there, fungal rich compost. All right, there's just a little example, another trick really, of how to use the newspaper sections on the sides of your swale. You see how I do that? And I like I leave my newspaper out to get wet. You know, I leave it out for a week or two at least. Same with my cardboard. It makes a difference if your newspaper is already, you know, damp and wet. If you're going out there with fresh newspaper, don't do it on a windy day. It, it'll be a comic show. So moist newspaper, be generous with it, overlay it. Again, can't say enough about doing that. All right, so larger swales. So ideally you are beginning your swales in the upper part of your watershed. So that means, let's say in your backyard, you've got a hill. You want to start toward the top of your hill with water harvesting, because if you're starting at the bottom of the hill, you're going to have a lot of water buildup and a lot of pressure, and you could blow your swales out, right? So that's the case with this one. So you can't always start at the top, but if you can, start at the top of your hill, and a general gauge to where to start your first swale is to start walking downhill from the very top of your hill, whatever that is, and come down until your eye level is at the top of the hill. So you're walking down the hill until your eye level at the top of the hill. Boom, that's a good place to start your new swale typically. And because you've created a capture zone, a little watershed, you need some area for water to begin, you know, moving and collecting. Then if you have a large landscape, you can walk down slope again until your eye level is at that first swale. There's your second swale. There's your next capture zone. Now that's on a larger landscape with spaced out swales. A lot of times I'll just do swale after swale after swale, and I'll create these gardens or these food forest areas and maximize and hold that humidity and all that moisture in one zone. So in this picture, you see stone at the input of where a lot of water was coming down. So their property line is right there. They can't do anything above it. The neighbors got the slope, their house runoff, and a bit of a funnel coming down. So not necessarily the most ideal place, but hey, that's what they had. So we buffered it with stone. So as that water comes in, it hits that stone, it dissipates the pressure and starts to spread it out. Now you'll also see there's stone in all of these paths. Now these paths also are the overflow. So they're intentionally designed overflows. And the trick to creating an overflow, there's two ways. You can build your swale and not build an overflow, wait and see if it does overflow, and then you'll know where to build your overflow because it'll show you. And the way to do that is if it's blowing out for you already somewhere, or not blowing out, but really overflowing for you naturally somewhere, go in there and take the soil down about a third of the height of the berm, yes. Bring it down about a third of its height, pack it hard, and then get some stones in there so that it acts like a dry creek. So as the water comes, it can go through there naturally without eroding the rest of your berm, right? Or you can intentionally set those overflows where you know you want pathways, as in the case of this garden, which had really long swales and you want to be able to walk through them. So we intentionally went ahead and made low spots that you could walk through, and we offset them. You can see they're offset, so as it runs through, it's not just going to run straight through, it's going to have time to go through each one of these. Now I did have to actually come back and do a little retrofitting on this because so much water came into this top one. It was rushing down, and actually this actually was not perfectly on contour because I had to follow their property line. So I did get some water shooting down the basin, and I had to slow it down. So what I did was I took more stones and I created these little gabions in the basin, you know, maybe about every 10 feet. Again, just getting that water to slow and sink, slow and sink. And that is what we're doing here. We're slowing, sinking, and spreading water. So the tipping point typically for a swale on a slope, if you have something that's steeper than 3 to 1, you're getting a little bit dodgy for swales. I won't say it can't be done because I've done it. when you can start high enough on it and you can start utilizing the swales. But typically, if you go over a 3-to-1, let me see if my brain can get this right. A 3-to-1 means that you have a 1 foot drop over 3 feet. So you can go out on your slope and you can go 3 feet out, and then you can see how far that is to the ground. And if it's 1 foot, that's 3-to-1. So if it goes steeper than that, if you're like a 2-to-1, then you're going to want to build a terrace. Basically, you're going to have to do a little bit of support for the earth. But these are terraces, basically. These are a variation of a rain garden. They're a variation of a terrace. These are all similar techniques in slightly different situations. Okay, well, actually, one thing I should also mention is you don't want to harvest your water going into the house, right? So there's a house down here, but it's fortunately off to the side of where we're harvesting this water, but it's getting a little close. You don't really want to be designing these so that they're going to harvest the water that goes right into your house, right? So keep that in mind. That's one of the places where you don't want to swale. So if you got a slope behind your house, don't build the swale where it's going to harvest right into your basement. Typically what I'll do in those circumstances is I will intentionally put the swale off contour. You know, I'll make sure it's got an off slope of 1 or 2%, and I will pull the water past the house. And then once I get past the house, the structure, I'll put it back on contour. Yeah, okay. So a larger landscape here, client had a lot of water that they wanted to steward. You know, they wanted to steward all the runoff from their property, some of the water coming in from their neighbor's property, and they wanted food forests. So it was like, well, let's do it all here. Let's capture all that water. And these are larger. This one I actually did with a small mini excavator. Mini excavators are great. They're pretty easy to use. All you need is a credit card. Surprisingly enough, you can rent one. And within a day, you could dig all these swales and really have fun doing it. Anyway, so after this picture, we put in more wood chips in the basins. She came and planted this with ground covers and now has fruit trees. And this is, now her food forest patches as well. So these become great places to plant your gardens, your fruit trees. I mean, it could even be your rose collection, your lilacs. Whatever it is, it's going to do really well. All right. This is a picture of our fenced-in garden here at Long Creek Homestead. And here you can see that we've done basin, berm, basin, berm, basin, berm, one after the other. I do this design a lot for gardens. The first basin in this circumstance harvests most of the water that's coming down the landscape and falls in and is able to sort of hydrate the rest of the garden. But regardless of that, even if you didn't have a lot of water coming in, this basin and berm, you've got these valleys. These basins are full of wood chips and organic matter. They're holding moisture. Regardless of what's coming in off landscape, within itself, it's holding a lot of moisture, creating microclimates. It creates such a perfect environment for plants and breaking down and compost and soil, fungi and biota to thrive in, because good soil building needs consistent moisture. Fungi and the bacteria and the biota in your soil need consistent moisture. If you've got exposed areas that get dried out by the sun, you've killed out the fungi. You've killed out the beneficial, bacteria and critters that are creating the fertility in your soil. Likewise, in the winter, I always have my soil covered. Now, if I'm going out there in the spring and I'm putting in let's say some radish seeds, fair enough. I will have a little bit of exposed, but as soon as those radishes come up, I'm tucking in organic matter around them. I do not like to see exposed soil at all, because I know it's detrimental to the health of the soil. So I'm a big proponent of keeping your soil covered with whatever that is for you aesthetically. I like straw again because it's a fast feeder of the soil. It really gets in there. Wood chips in the pads, straw on the beds. And as you can see, a lot of times the straw gets in the wood pad in the pads as well, which is all good let me see what else I'm going to say. Oh, yeah. So a lot of times in designs, what I'll do is I'll take the downspouts off of a house and I will run sort of that flexi tube. And let's say there's 3 different downspouts coming off a house in the direction of my garden. I will take one of those flexi tubes from the downspout and I will drop it into the first basin. I'll take the other one, I'll drop it into the second basin. I'll take the third one, I'll drop it into the third basin. Then you're really harvesting and pulling and capturing all that moisture off of your hardscapes. So you can really pull that water and utilize it in your gardens.
Michael, let me just give you a heads up that there are a few people who didn't quite understand the A-frame, so they're having trouble understanding how they're gonna design this. So if there's a moment to explain that as you're going through, re-explain it so that you can clarify.
So the A-frame being built is very simple. I think I even have it on my website if you're not going to go for my awesome book. It should explain it there. I mean, there's plenty. You Google it. It's a very commonly made tool for finding contour. It's helping you find the level part of your landscape. So really, it's the 3 pieces calibrated. Again, I just encourage you to go and Google and find that out. That information's easy and it's out there. What it's used for is finding contour. So you're finding where your landscape is constantly level. So when you look at like a topography map of a mountain, you see those squiggly lines going all the way around it. That's showing you where it's staying completely level all the way around that mountain. It's going to change as the slopes vary. So by going out there and using your A-frame, you're getting to see where that contour is on your landscape. And then typically what I'll do is I will use those flags as my center point, meaning that I will then go ahead and I will measure on the upslope side 20 to 30 inches for my basin. And then I will measure from my original flags down 3 feet, and that'll be my berm. So that way I will do it that way. There's variations on how you can decide to position your basin and berm, but that's how I do it. So I'll use my A-frame. I'll go ahead and I'll get my line of flags all the way out there. I'll see my contour. Then I'll come back and I'll measure up 20, 30 inches. I'll go ahead and mark that again, maybe with another flag or maybe with some spray. And then I'll go down slope 3 feet, 36 inches, and that's my raised berm. So yeah, I hope that explains it. If not, it's really kind of an easy thing to find and learn more about. Okay, I think I have a quick video I just took of our garden, partly which is going to show you the basin and berm model here. Let's see if I can get it to work. Yeah.
And cattle panel fencing, great for growing grapes and other vertical climbers. This garden is also used for our nursery propagation. So we do cuttings, we grow out seeds, then we graft, then we...
Sorry, I'm gonna start from the beginning.
Welcome to Long Creek Homestead's garden. We have built this garden on contour, meaning that we've dug these basins and created these berms to passively harvest the rainwater moving down the landscape. It is amazingly moisture retentive. It is fenced in by black locust and cattle panel fencing, great for growing grapes and other vertical climbers. This garden is also used for our nursery propagation. So we do cuttings, we grow out seeds that we graft, then we bear root and sell forward, always keeping everything generously covered with organic matter, straw and cardboard and newspaper. This creates a microclimate and a constant moisture that plants love. Here you can see our tag system for our cuttings. And in the corner where we have a tree shading is a perfect natural nursery spot. So we are keeping a lot of our extra pots and plants here so we don't have to water them as much. And then at the entrance here is a hardy kiwi arbor that has just 1 male and 1 female. These are beautiful vines, very productive. Make sure you've got good support for them. Down here is an herb spiral just coming to life over the winter with some overwintering oregano and garlic. These are beautiful. And we always have a perennial bed in the garden to help balance the insect ecology. Yay.
All right. Okay, so we could simplify this even further by doing a very simple small swale to capture the water off of one downspout, right? This is kind of a beginner level if you're not ready to jump in to see how beneficial this can be. And again, to steward the runoff from our hardscapes, I believe is very important. So you want to come, I would say, at least 15 feet or 15 feet from your house, 10 to 15 if it's downslope and there's no danger of really harvesting that water into your house before you start creating your swale. And again, you can see how this is pretty much just a smiley face, your arms stretched out to receive the water that comes down. Again, simple basin and berm. I recommend, if nothing else, doing a little one of these. This could just be 10 feet in length, and go ahead and plant it, and you will see how phenomenal this design is. And pay attention, because if it's grass and lawn below it, you'll see that'll become very green and lush and verdant. So it doesn't have to be an elaborate start. You could do this, for each one of your downspouts. Okay, so another variation here is harvesting the water through a network of mycelium, through fungi. So fungi and mycelium act as a natural web that helps break down, filter, and actually digest and convert pollutants and runoff. So this picture is taken just below a downspout from a house going toward a creek. So in this case, we dug out on contour there, perfectly perpendicular to the slope. And here in this case, we've put in coffee sacks that are filled with wood chips, but you could just quite simply fill it with wood chips. There's the mycelium filter. You can see anything going through that's going to really get digested and eaten. And then when you're done, this can be something you can mow over. So this is kind of a version of a swale without the raised berm. Again, so not necessarily something you're going to plant into, but something that is slowing, sinking, and filtering the water. Hold on. I knew I'd forget to unplug that thing. All right. Here's another picture of the combination of the swale and the basin and the berm. And here you can see we're inoculating our basin wood chips with the wine cap, the garden giant Stropharia mushroom, which is a great stacking of functions to get more food out of the space, help break those wood chips down. And you can see this swale too. You see how it kind of curves and then goes off and up in the back of the picture. It's just following contour as the slope above it changes. And then as you walk along this path now, you can work and harvest and use it as your access to the raised berm. And when you step on the fungi within that path, it stimulates it to fruit. So this is an awesome example of stacking functions. This is a picture of Paul Stamets, who's doing a similar design on contour. So you see how it's curving. So just upslope of this is some sort of factory farm with a lot of effluent runoff. Downslope of this swale here is a very sensitive bog ecosystem. So to help cleanse and protect that, on contour, you can see how it's snaking. This has been filled with coffee sacks filled with wood chips, and I'm going to guess probably Stropharia mushroom as well, so that as that effluent comes down, it stops. And since it's on contour, it's going to hold it there while the fungi begin to digest it. So you're just showing you this concept of the swale on contour and stacking that function with the fungi to clean up runoff. Very important. Okay. Hugelkultur. Hugelkultur is a Germanic word, basically meaning wood covered with soil. It is what we see happen naturally in mature forests. So when you're walking in a mature old forest, it's lumpy. And that's from trees that have fallen and decades of leaves falling on top of those trees. And if you go and you kick one of those old logs and it's all black and rich and teeming with life, awesome compost, right? So it's taking that observation and saying, okay, well, on many landscapes, certainly in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, we're very fortunate to have lots of deciduous trees and just lots of trees in general. And a lot of times they're coming down in storms, or in suburbia, someone's always cutting a tree. There's all this wood that typically is being exported. It's like, oh, let's take this wood and get it off our site. Really, you never want organic matter to leave your site. You want to hold that. And one of the ways to do this is creating hugelkultur beds. And it's really just kind of doing that long-term compost in place. And this can be many scales, as I'll show you. Here's an example. Actually, someone in New Jersey sent me this image. And this is just, all kinds of chunks and sizes of wood. It can be new wood. It can be old wood. If it's old wood, you get a little bit of a jump start, but ultimately everything's going to break down. Just might take longer. This was then the sod. You can see the sod to the side. That was put back on sort of grass face down. So you're flipping the sod upside down, and then you're putting the soil. In this case, and in many cases, what you can do is you can dig out the basin, right? Put in your wood, and then you've got the soil to put right back over it. Alternatively, and I'll show you some other examples where if you have soil, so I get a lot of soil from rain gardens, so I will sometimes have excess soil. So I'll go ahead on flat ground and start laying my wood, and then I'll bring soil in. But typically, to get your soil, you're digging it out and you're putting it over it. A lot of times this can be done on contour, but you do want to be careful, especially if you're on a bit of a slope and there's structures or houses or something down below. If it's perfectly on contour and you've got all this wood built up, it's possible that it could break loose and go down slope. It's been known to happen. In that case, with your hugelkultur, you want to make it slightly off contour so that if there is excessive water, it would actually go around it rather than blow it out. And then voila, something like this size will start to drop probably half a foot a year and settle at about, maybe 18 inches into this really nice, rich compost that holds moisture, because it's like a big wick in there. And then it also has all of the sort of fertility and compost breaking down. So when you come and plant into it, boom, it has everything it needs. So here's a larger one. This one I definitely did with a machine. And because it was, I'll explain why in a minute, because it's quite a large one to help manage quite a bit of water and harvest it for a garden. So dug this out, dug the soil out, piled in a bunch of poplar that had come down in a storm, right? Packed it in there as tight as I could, breaking the sticks and getting them down in there, trying to really, make sure there's not a whole lot of airspace if you can help it. Then flip that sod. I have one piece that's sticking up, but all the other are down. That all gets face down. And then it gets covered again with the soil. And then I generously cover this with straw. And I think I sowed a bunch of cow pea to some kind of, nitrogen fixer ground cover on it. And I went ahead and put some stones around it. You could border it or not. But this sits right in front of a garden that is also, laid out on contour, but the slope above it actually had a lot of water coming down, and it would have blown out those garden swales. So this big hugelkultur bed is doing many things. It's helping that water stop, sink in, slow down that rush, and it hydrates it for that garden behind it. Also creates a little bit more of a wind block for it. And then it becomes a great place to plant your perennials, which creates more habitat around your garden. So you can really stack a lot of functions in with this. And this size, this is probably almost 5 feet. And this was done at least, 7 years ago. It's down, at about 2 feet tall now, and it's rich in there, and it's the perfect time to be planting into. So you can plant into it with more shallow rooted things in the early years. A lot of times I'll plant something like raspberries or cane fruits, things that can deal, because this is going to shift and move. So I wouldn't go in there and stick a tree in there because it's going to wonk. Maybe some bushes, that can take that, something like an aronia or a black currant, something that even if it gets thrown off, will still reshoot and regrow. And then maybe once it's totally mature and down, then I'll come along and I'll stick some trees in it. There are a few sweet spots to stick trees in right away. And I'll see if I get another shot to show you those sweet spots. This is a smaller scale, Harvey Ussery lent me this picture. This is his garden. So it could just be your prunings. It could be small twigs, things like that. You give a little hugelkultur bed in your garden, let it break down. And after a year or two, you come in there and start growing, your onions and other things in it. And it's just going to be rich, moist, and fertile. So the scale is really kind of up to you. Again, these they're on contour, using leaves, using whatever organic matter you have, straw, stuff it in there, grass. Now, the one thing I've learned along the way is I think some of my first hugelkultur beds I ever did were really high in wood because I have a lot of wood here to deal with. And I was doing something more along the lines of 70% wood to 30% soil. So it wasn't a very thick skin, so to say, of soil. And that's fine, but I couldn't get in there and plant a whole lot, and it took longer for things to break down. And over the years, if I've had the option, I've gone more for a 50-50. If I can get 50 wood and I can get 50% soil on top of that, I find that the more moisture is held, breaks down faster. I'm able to get in there earlier and start getting things and other plants going. I get comfrey Egyptian walking onions going really quickly in these things. So go for 50-50, but again, if you don't have that much soil, you have a lot more wood, it's fine. Eventually it will be breaking down. Keep trying to cover it with straw. More moisture you can hold in it, the faster it will break down. But this is a bit of a thing of patience. Typically you're investing a little bit of energy, but then you're waiting for time, and it does make the most amazing raised beds in the long run. This is a huge one. So when I built my house, I had a lot of wood, extra wood. And typically what you see when someone's building a house is these little black, poly woven fences down there, kind of ugly and pathetic looking for all the runoff and all the soil and everything that's running down. It's supposed to be protecting that runoff. Well, what if all the trees that they took off that site were put into hugelkulturs that helped harvest and filter all that runoff? And then when people moved in, they had somewhere to plant. I guess that just makes too much sense. All right, this bed was 6 feet tall. This was actually built with a machine as well. This was, gosh, how long ago is this? This is like 7 years old, this picture. And today that is about 3 feet tall, and I'm planting jujubes in it, juneberries, some select willows. I mean, all kinds of stuff. I'm sticking whatever in there now because it's really kind of broken and juicy right now. Okay, this is another hugelkultur bed. This one was 5 feet tall when I built it. And this picture is probably about the 3rd year. In the left corner there, you can see a little bit of wood sticking out. And I'm just starting to get my Egyptian walking onions in there. I'm getting some comfrey in there. It's still kind of at the early stages, so I'm not really planting a whole lot into it. Now I'll show you the sweet spot. So even right after you build your hugelkultur bed, if you want to plant in it, so right here where it goes concave, sort of at the base, of the hugelkultur bed here. So imagine you put all the soil on that wood. Some of it's going to naturally slough off, and you're going to get sort of this really nice sort of rich soil part right there at the base. That's a juicy spot. I go in there, I'll plant my pawpaws, I'll plant other trees in there. And so what happens is they're in kind of a nice soil. And as that hugelkultur next to them is breaking down, they'll be able to take their roots and shoot into it and get what they need from it without actually being in it. So there's a sweet spot for getting your trees going early. You can create microclimates with your hugelkultur bed. If it's got a south-facing side, you know, you can take advantage of that. Maybe try to put your figs in there. If it's on your north-facing side, you know, maybe get your gooseberries and your currants in there. This helps slow down the wind. I mean, if you wanted to create kind of an instant barrier, build a huge hugelkultur bed. You know, you got a road at the end of your yard, build a huge hugelkultur bed, and then as it starts to break down, get in there and plant it. And as it comes down, your trees will come up and you can create long-term barriers. So, man, hugelkulturs, can't say enough about them. All right, now here's stacking it all together. We got the swale. You can also do a swale hugelkultur combo. A lot of times I'll do that. There's wood around, and I'm not going to be using my swale raised berm right away for my garden or something. I'll throw the wood in, cover it, and then this can also be your food forest zone. So here's a great sort of stacked function permaculture design. I think it comes out of it's from the Bible, what we call the Bible, the permaculture by Bill Mollison, David Holmgren, but it's been modified by Bill Wilson of Midwest Permaculture. So credit to those guys being awesome permaculture ninjas. Okay. So this is actually a series of rain gardens. And again, rain gardens these are all variations doing similar things. So typically people get discouraged to do a rain garden because when you are Googling it or learning about it for the first time, it can be very overwhelming, and you see all these you know, all this data and statistics and measurements you need. And that's for municipal water. That's for a lot of water. Typically for your landscape on a small scale, a rain garden can be very simple. It's just a depression in the earth with a fast draining soil. Think of it as like an upside down mitt. So that has like usually sand mixed in and a lot of organic matter. The ratio that I work with is 50% sand, 25% topsoil, and 25% compost. Now that's a different ratio than what you usually read. A lot of times they're like 80% sand, but I think that limits a lot of what you can grow in it, and not necessary in most cases, especially on the home scale. So I'm more rich with my soil and compost than typical, and I get a lot back for that. You know, these gardens are much more productive. They can become edible oases as well. That's another thing. A lot of these rain gardens, people just put, these drought tolerant plants and don't really think about this being as like a great growing food space. It is a wonderful growing food space. What is it that's done really well in this particular garden is the beach plum. So the beach plum is something that doesn't do too well in our area because it's humid. We have heavy clay soils. It gets funky. In these rain gardens, they are thriving. They've got good drainage. In this case, they've got good airflow. June berries do really well in this. In my new pawpaw book, I outlined some rain garden designs using pawpaws and other fruits as well. Okay, so this was that space you were just looking at before I got to it. And the client's house is on the left. On the right, a new neighbor just built a house and very thoughtfully graded it so it all ran into this little piece of yard. Plus, they had all the water from the neighbor behind them coming down. So a lot of water coming through this zone. Luckily, it's really perfectly well sloped. So I got in there, that mini excavator I was telling you about, and dug it up, tore it up. But I wanted to pull the water out from around the house because you don't want that water sitting next to the house. So I did a French drain. French drain is just a ditch with gravel, and you can see the tube at the bottom pulling out excess water. A little trick I do that's I think is very important is I will line French drains with heavy duty landscape fabric and cover it completely like it's a package so that soil's not getting in there and clogging it up. Anyway, it drops into that first basin, that overflows into the second, overflows into the third, and we caught pretty much all the water that comes out of it. There's the mixture, sand, soil, compost. There it is, gorgeous when it's done. I mean, you drive by this and you just think, wow, what an awesome looking landscape, but it's also extremely functional. It's harvesting all that water. And those we planted up with the beach plums and the June berries, and then all kinds of other companion plants around it, kind of like a little food forest in your rain garden. So, yeah. Oh, there it is. Look, that's just the second year. I am not kidding. That's like 2 years, and it just exploded. You can see the beach plums there and all kinds of, I mean, just things go crazy in there. Part of that's because we added that, 25% topsoil and that 25% compost in there. So don't think that rain gardens need to be super complex, especially on the home scale. Anything that starts to harvest and sink and slow that water is a benefit to your watershed. All right. So last thing I'm going to share is large scale, right? For you farmers out there. This is what's called a yeoman's plow. This is kind of a special made one out of Australia. It's called the keyline plow, but really any deep shank will work. And that's a common implement that you can find, in most farming communities have one or two of these deep shanks that can go in. They usually rip the soil, usually because a hard pan gets created and water kind of goes down about 18 inches and then just sheets underground off of the hard pan and leaves your landscapes really dry. So this goes through and it rips the soil on contour. Ideally you're following contour, and there's, if you learn more about the keyline design, there's a little bit of play with that contour, but really the idea is that on a larger landscape, you can begin hydrating and sort of ripping it with these little miniature swales almost, though you don't really get a raised berm. This allows that water that's coming down the landscape, stop, fall in, hydrate, and this can really amazingly transform pastures. If you were going to come in, say this was misused, and you were going to then start planting it with trees and perennial crops, nut trees, then going ahead and ripping it and getting that hydration started will make a huge difference. You can actually go ahead and plant your trees into the rips. So if this pertains to your circumstance, I highly recommend you learning more about the keyline design. There's good videos out there, of course, but ripping larger scale is a way to hydrate landscapes that really need it. And I think that's it. Yeah, there's our website. Go and learn more about all these things. I have a lot of information on my website that details these designs and a lot more. And then, of course, my books. All right, fire me up. What's the questions?
The geese had just stepped out. This is her husband, so I'm trying to figure out how to unmute people. Oh, she's coming. No.
All right. Everybody should be unmuted at this point. Okay. Any questions, anybody?
What did you want to say?
Michael, what's the effect of different soil types on the on those swales?
Well, I think it's going to benefit any type. You're talking sort of sandy to clay, sort of spectrum. The heavier you get into a clay soil, the more you're going to want to make sure you've got good overflows. I think always you should think about where water is going to go once it exits your swale, your rain garden, around your hugelkultur bed. You always want to plan for the excess water, and in a clay soil, that's going to be more the case. That's probably going to swell up, and then it could overflow more easily. So that's one obvious.
You're distracting me.
With that heavy clay soil, will that water work its way through and hydrate below to any extent, or does it tend to run it off?
No, it should. I mean, because you have your basin. So regardless, you've got what's held in your basin. So if you have a heavy clay soil, it might sit there for, even the better part of a day while it's slowly filtering in. So you might get some excess runoff, right? So whatever the basin can't hold is going to move on. But then slowly that's going to move down. And the more that you're putting wood chips into your basin with a heavy clay soil is you're conditioning it. So over time, that organic matter is getting down into that basin, softening it up and making it, accept more water, and just conditioning your clay soil with organic matter, which is what you need to do anyway. Yeah.
And with the wood chips, can you load that basin pretty much full?
Oh yeah, I do. I load it high. It'll start to drop, even from putting it in, when the air comes out of it. So I really do. I mean, if you have the material, if not, whatever. I mean, I've done some swales on large landscapes where I haven't put anything in the basin. I might throw some seeds, some grass seeds or something in there, and it's still going to function. But yeah, on a smaller scale and where you're able to get the wood chips, load them up, because that just holds humidity and builds compost in place for you. And, it depends what you're planting into it. If you're planting perennials, so one of the main concepts for the swale, especially in permaculture, is that you're planting perennials into it that are going to do the long-term, job of the water harvesting and holding organic matter on the landscape. So there's almost kind of two types of swales. One we call a dead man swale, and that's the one I've shown you. You dig it out. And then there's the living swale, where you go along and you don't dig or do anything. You find your contour, and then you intensively plant along your contour. So when I lived in Nicaragua, for more than 12 years, I lived on the side of a volcano that was full of rocks. Nice soil, but full of rocks. I couldn't dig. But I had to slow that water down. So I found contour, and I got like vetiver grass and lemongrass, things that had really nice deep roots. And I went ahead and I planted it really tightly all along that contour. And that's a living swale. So as water comes down the landscape, it actually is slowed down above ground and below ground when it's hitting the roots and the shoots. And that also harvests the runoff and the organic matter, and over time starts to build its own terrace. So you can intensively plant along contour and create a living swale. And really, by creating what we call a physical dead man swale, is you're just kind of jump starting the process and really just getting a start for getting those perennial trees in place that will do the work for you in the long run. Now that's the ideal. Now if it's your garden or a more intimate interactive space, and you're going to do annuals and other things on it, then fair enough.
Good. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question
about hugelkultur. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Question twofold. One is, in the woody material in creating that, is there any problem with using ailanthus that have been downed? That's the first question. And secondly, you said it took about 3 years for your large mass to break down, and then you could plant whatever you wanted to on top of that. Are there ways to speed up the process, or do partial planting, or what?
Okay, so, I mean, ultimately you can use anything. Everything's going to break down. Pine, ailanthus, hemlock, you name it, it's going to break down, right? And so it might just be a matter of more time for those things to break down and not have allelopathic properties to them. I've not experimented with Atlantis after 3 years, but I would not be afraid to do it or to try it. I don't think I would run into troubles with it, not that far down the road. Fungi and everything would have been in there and broken down, the constructs and the chemicals, in the trees. So yeah, I'd use it. Atlantis should actually break down pretty fast because it's such a soft wood. And there's oyster mushrooms that are being successfully grown on Atlantis as well. So I mean, the fungi are going to get in there and eat them up. So your other part of your question, if you wanted to speed it up, I would do a higher percentage of soil to wood. So, maybe do 30% wood and 70% soil. Then you've got a lot more soil to plug into. You've got more moisture holding that's going to break down your wood faster, so you can be more generous with your soil. You can plant right away depending on how deep how thick your soil level is. I would just put more shallow rooted things in there, or things that will be more drought tolerant per se. Get a good ground cover on it is highly recommended. And what else did I want to say? I'm distracted by all these voices.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right.
What's the definition of color soil?
Right.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I have a Hugelkultur bed on the edge of my property, which is parallel to a road. It's on the Hugelkultur bed is on the top of the hill. And I was planning to divert the water runoff from the road to the bed. Is that something that you would recommend, or is that too soiled of a water to
Well, I mean, it depends on the volume of water. I think in theory, it's a good idea, to be able to pull water in and hold it. If it's not going to be affecting any structures, I think it's great. One thing to be wary of is, if it's too much water, it could blow your hugelkultur out. Is there any wood of scale in there that could cause trouble downslope? Can you moderate?
Signing up for a beekeeping class?
I don't think that there's anything that would blow out, but I was just more worried about the chemicals coming from the road, like salt, maybe, from
right
during the winter time. Is that something that the organic material can filter out?
So we're thinking about burgers and maybe some rice. And what do you want for vegetable?
Okay, time out.
Yes, yeah.
If you're still on and you're making dinner, I totally understand. But then can you mute, please?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a great question. Salt runoff is probably one of your bigger issues there. I think any of the chemical runoff, it'd be an opportunity to steward, some of that runoff. And I feel like it's up to us to steward the stuff ourselves. So the salt, if it built up, it could just burn. But if your bed's raised, a lot of that stuff might go in the lower levels and slowly be broken down and digested.
Okay.
And your trees and your things that might be in the higher level might take it. And then maybe use things that take salt, more readily, like aronia, black chokeberry. I love it. I love that one. And Viking is a great cultivar. And if you plant that in there, I know that they're pretty salt tolerant, and you might sort of steer things towards some of your more salt tolerant plants. But I mean, I encourage it just because we need to steward this runoff. So if you can kind of moderate how much water comes in, if you're digging sort of a trench or something to it, maybe limit how much water's coming through it to test it. But I mean, if it was me, I'd be going for it.
Okay, I think we have one last question. Can you please describe your preferred soil quality in terms of percent organic matter and any other general characteristics?
I'm not much of I'm not much of a science nerd when it comes to these things.
Well, okay, let me help you out here.
Okay.
Hey, so I know this sounds like a little advertisement for another course, but there is a soil webinar that is planned for the 27th of May, and it's a free webinar offered off of our a CIG grant that NOFA New Jersey has. So if anyone wants to dive deeper into soil testing and better soil, you can dial into that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, what, 5% is generous, and I mean, my soils are extremely rich. They're awesome and spongy and very much alive, and there's tons of food in them all the time. I mean, there's tons of organic matter, which is what you're after. And you know, rather than, I mean, I don't know, I shouldn't say rather than, but you know, if you put these practices into place, you will see how rich, bioactive, and spongy, you know, your soils become. It creates the most amazing sort of tilth that I know of. So, you know, the proof's in the pudding, so to say. So, you know, go for it and you let us know. You measure.
Okay, well, I think that covers all the questions we have for this week. One more session, pretty exciting. Michael, that's the one on fruit trees, right?
Yeah, food forest and fruits. Yeah, we're gonna geek out on plants and some design ideas and just, you know, setting the stage for them a little bit as well. But yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right, guys. Just a reminder, if you need a link to one of the previous week's presentations and you have not sent me your email, please do that. And I will go ahead and send you the link. Okay, so have a great week, everybody, and thanks for dialing in.
Thanks for joining.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you.
Thanks.